As I'm sure you have all seen by now, I even discussed this on my NBA channel as well if you follow along there, but it has been reported that the Suns are exploring options and moving on from Chris Paul, whether waiving him from the team or looking to move him in a trade. And ever since this was reported, which the reporting in and of itself was a little botched, where you had Chris Haynes implying Paul was already informed that he was being waived, to then Shams and Woj stating they're exploring options, including moving him in a trade or even waiving him and then signing him in free agency on a cheaper deal or more team-friendly deal anyway. But regardless, ever since this news broke out, I've seen countless Bulls fans, Bulls accounts and pages talking about the possibility of Chris Paul coming to Chicago. He did, after all, play for Billy Donovan in that one season in Oklahoma City, which was one of Paul's best seasons of his career and really revitalized his career after most had assumed he was starting to decline in his final years in Houston. But to all of those Bulls fans, I ask, why? Why bring in Chris Paul now at this stage in his career? And yes, I do see some benefit in bringing in a player like Chris Paul, which I'll speak to, but does that even make sense for the Bulls given the current state of their roster? So let's talk about it. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I do want to be clear, and I discussed this in my video yesterday on the second channel, that it is a little strange that the Suns would look to simply waive CP3, not look to get anything back in return, and take the hit on the partial guarantee of his salary for the next 2 seasons on their books, because even though Chris Paul is obviously not the same player he used to be, he's not going to give you 20 points per game and 10 assists, nor is he going to give you elite level defense that he once possessed, and of course, he's always had issues staying healthy, but he's still a very serviceable point guard, a savvy veteran, a facilitator, a floor general, and honestly, it's exactly the type of point guard a team like the Suns need when you have 2 elite offensive players in Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. So all that is to say, I do find it odd that the Suns would look to move on from him, as really the only backup option they have at this point would be Cam Payne, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was a waive and then re-signing him to a cheaper deal scenario. But be all of that as it may, say the Suns do waive Chris Paul, making him an unrestricted free agent, and he becomes free to sign wherever he wants. There is literally one and only one scenario in which Bulls fans should be okay with bringing him in, and that's if the Bulls refuse to make any major adjustments to their roster. In other words, they decide to run it back. They double down on continuity and looking to win now, and if they go that route, which again is a very likely scenario, but if they go that route and then offer Chris Paul only a vet minimum deal, a 1-year vet minimum deal, then sure, I would be open to it. The Bulls do need a true point guard, someone that can actually run the floor, manage the flow of the offense, a facilitator with great court vision, something they have been without since losing Lonzo Ball. But only a 1-year deal at the minimum, because Chris Paul is 38 years old. Likely won't be able to play the whole season, and anything longer than that or higher in terms of the dollar amount would be a huge mistake when it's pretty clear that this team is in need of a more long-term solution than short-term. And Paul would be a very, very short-term solution to the Bulls' problems. Not that any of this matters anyway, because at the end of the day, if Paul is waived and can go wherever he wants, you really think he's going to choose Chicago? Sure, big market, yes, familiarity with the coach, but Chris Paul at this stage in his career, nearly 20 years in the NBA. He wants to win a championship. He wants to play for a contender. And if we're being honest with ourselves, Bulls fans, the Bulls are not that. And adding a 38-year-old Chris Paul would make the Bulls marginally better. They're not going to suddenly become a title contender because of his presence alone. For Chris Paul, you're really talking next season, maybe the season after that, as his last 2 chances to finally win a ring. I don't see him playing into his 40s. Thus, Chris Paul is likely going to go to a team like the Celtics, Sixers, maybe the Lakers or the Clippers, a team that is in need of a point guard that is really that one missing piece away to having them legitimately contend for a title. I personally think the Celtics would make the most sense for Chris Paul, given the Celtics don't have a true point guard and are in need of some veteran leadership to get them over the hump. I don't like it because I can't stand the Celtics, and them getting Chris Paul likely makes them even better, but if I was a betting man, I would say Chris Paul likely signs with the Celtics should he actually be waived by the Suns. Now, as it relates to the Bulls, say there is a world in which Chris Paul would actually consider Chicago. I don't necessarily like the fit, because while the Bulls need a starting point guard, a guard that is actually focused on passing and getting the most of his primary scores is absolutely an upgrade compared to what the Bulls had to work with last season between Io, Patrick Beverley, and at times Alex Caruso and Coby White. But at the same time, and I've said this before, this is just delaying the inevitable of the Bulls needing to tear things down and start building for the future. By bringing in Chris Paul, they're sort of clinging to this idea that somehow they think they can still compete. that they were essentially there, but everything was derailed when they lost their starting point guard in Lonzo Ball, and that bringing in a world-class point guard, a future Hall of Famer to the squad, that can get the Bulls back to where they were at the start of that 21-22 season, holding on to the hope that they're still able to win now because continuity trumps all. It's just going to end up being another season of more or less the same thing from last year, maybe slightly better, maybe they make the playoffs as the 7 or 8 seed, and then what? You now have a 39-year-old Chris Paul who is likely on his way to retirement. DeMar and Vooch are older, Zach is older, all the while you haven't been focusing on developing your younger players because of all these veterans that you put together to win, when in reality, they haven't been winning. So while yes, I'm not saying bringing in Chris Paul would be a disaster, I do actually think it would improve the team marginally, but it wouldn't change anything for the future outlook of this team, and the longer the Bulls hold off on making significant changes, hoping that the group they have is suddenly going to turn things around, the assets that they do have are going to continue to lose value, which further perpetuates the cycle of remaining in mediocrity where they don't have their draft picks, they don't have cap space, and they have little trade assets to work with as the value of their players goes down. Oh, also, I know some have been saying, hey, you could also just trade for Chris Paul since we know he wouldn't sign with the Bulls as a free agent, but if we were to trade for him, that would guarantee that the Bulls would actually get him. But do you guys know how much Chris Paul is owed on his contract, which the Bulls would have to fully guarantee if they did trade for him? $30.8 million for this upcoming season for a 38-year-old. And then he's also owed $30 million the following season, although that is partially guaranteed. Why would the Bulls ever take on that contract, and who would they even trade to even be able to match the salary to bring him in? Are you trading DeMar for Chris Paul? Vucevic? Is Zach Lavine being included in the deal? In what world would that ever make sense for the Bulls to give up any of those players for Chris Paul at this stage in his career? So a trade is out. That's not happening. Not saying Chris Paul can't get traded to some other team, but it won't happen for the Bulls. The Bulls would be absolutely foolish to give up assets to get Chris Paul. It's either a 1-year vet minimum deal, or it's a hard pass to bring him in. And as I've said before, Chris Paul is not signing a vet minimum deal with the Bulls when there will be other teams bidding for him that would have more to offer in terms of title contention than the Bulls would. So anyway, I know this is kind of an annoying video because it's basically just me ranting about why Chris Paul isn't going to be coming to Chicago, but I had a lot of you guys message me about it, asking for a video on it, so here it is. Let me know what you guys think though, and if you disagree with my take on the matter, let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.